Welcome to Civic Voices, the podcast where we explore democracy, civic engagement, and today's most pressing global issues. I'm Akash, your host.
And I'm Terri, your co host. Today, we're asking a question inspired by Astra Taylor's 2018 documentary, What is Democracy? Can democracy actually address climate change?
The film challenges us to think of democracy as more than elections. It argues democracy, dependency on participation, accountability, and citizens working together to solve shared problems. Climate change is one of the biggest shared problems the world has ever faced.
That's why this whole episode is built around our global campaign, Climate Action. Every member of our team dug into a different piece of this question, and we're bringing it all together today.
Let's start with something the documentary forces us to confront directly. Can real democracy exist when economic power is concentrated in a handful of corporations, while ordinary citizens bear the brunt of global crisis? With climate change, the imbalance is stark. Vulnerable communities absorb the environmental damage, while major industrial actors keep the profits private.
That's exactly the tension I kept running into from a different angle. I spent time with Isaac Julian's Smithsonian video installation, Lessons of the Hour, which weaves Frederick Douglass's 19th century abolitionist speeches together with scenes from modern racial justice protests like Freddie Gray in Baltimore. Douglass's focus on human rights and structural inequality feels just as urgent today as it was then.
How so?
Because structural inequality isn't a separate issue from climate change, it directly drives it. Marginalized communities face the worst impacts of environmental degradation while having the fewest resources to adapt. When we only talk about climate change in terms of emissions or economic growth, we erase the people who are already living the consequences.
That connects to our climate action campaign in a real way. It's calling for systematic economic transitions and mandatory corporate climate resilience strategies. But how we get there depends heavily on who you ask. Let's look at two differently positioned think tanks to see how these ideologies clash. The World Economic Forum takes a global stakeholder approach. They argue climate risk is financial risk, and that integrating environmental and governance metrics into corporate decision making isn't just ethical, it's essential for long term stability.
On the other side, the Heritage Foundation cautions against mandatory regulations. They argue top down mandates distort free markets, raise energy costs for everyday consumers, and overstep government's role.
Both perspectives point to the same tension. How do we balance market freedom with urgent public protection? Our policy proposal is a middle ground, binding climate resilience standards paired with transparent market incentives. Require corporations to publicly disclose climate vulnerabilities and transition plans, and offer tax credits for verified renewable investments.
But policy on paper isn't the whole story. I also looked at the DC Climate and Security think tank, which frames climate change mainly through national security and grid resilience, a threat multiplier, not a civil rights issue. Compare that to Alex Trembath's piece for the Breakthrough Institute, The Era of the Climate Hawk is Over, which argues that tying climate action to social justice agendas has alienated voters and slowed practical progress. He pushes for clean tech and market solutions over what he calls ideological battles.
So, where do you land on that?
Treating technology as a silver bullet ignores history. Who gets the clean energy jobs? Where do the battery plants and industrial waste facilities actually get built? Without centering environmental justice, pragmatic infrastructure just reproduces the same systemic patterns that put frontline communities in harm's way to begin with. Real resilience means protecting the most vulnerable first. That's not a side issue. That's the core of the question.
Welcome back. I'm Joe, and I looked at climate action through the lens of participation, representation, and trust. One moment from What is Democracy stood out to me. Taylor's conversation with residents in Miami who felt completely disconnected from the decisions affecting their community. That scene shows democracy depends on more than having systems in place. It depends on whether people feel heard and included. That connects directly to what Terry was just describing. Telling people a crisis exists isn't enough. Climate action requires building trust, encouraging participation, and creating real opportunities for communities to help shape solutions, especially the communities Terry's talking about, the ones already bearing the worst of it. Now, looking at the climate action campaign through this democratic lens, an important question emerges. How do we create urgency around climate change while still ensuring that people feel included in the process? Climate change affects communities through issues like flooding, extreme heat, and rising costs. But information alone does not always lead to action. Democratic engagement requires connecting awareness with opportunities for people to participate and understand how decisions are made. Taylor's documentary demonstrates that when people feel excluded, trust in institutions can weaken. The same challenge applies to climate action. Communities are more likely to support solutions when their experience and concerns are recognized. So, to understand the larger debate, I also examined two think tank resources with different perspectives: the Brookings Institution and the Heritage Foundation. Brookings generally emphasizes government coordination, investment, and policy planning as tools for addressing climate change. The Heritage Foundation, in contrast, argues that extensive federal climate regulations can create economic challenges and emphasizes market-based solutions and technological innovation instead. These two perspectives show an important part of democracy. Public issues are often debated through competing values, priorities, and interpretations of evidence. Recognizing different viewpoints doesn't mean ignoring the urgency of climate change. It allows for more informed conversations about possible solutions. Ultimately, democracy and climate action are connected because solving major challenges require both effective solutions and public trust. The question isn't only what actions we take, but whether people feel included in deciding those actions.
Thanks, Joe. Well, I'm Daniela, and I want to slow down and go deeper into the economic side of what Akash raised earlier. So, when we look at the climate crisis, the power imbalance he described it becomes starkly visible. So, vulnerable communities face several environmental degradation, yet major industrial actors often shift the burden of risk onto the public while keeping profits private. Um, Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin make the case in their 2018 piece called A Manifesto to Save Planet Earth and Ourselves. So, to avoid ecological collapse, we have to break the high production, high consumption model at the center of consumer capitalism and shift toward environmental repair. That's not a fringe idea anymore. It's showing up in how major institutions are starting to talk about corporate accountability, which brings us back to the WEF and Heritage Foundation positions that Akash and Terry laid out. So, our policy brief addresses this tension head on by proposing a middle ground framework. Biden climate resilience standards combined with transparent market incentives by requiring corporations to publicly disclose climate vulnerabilities and transition plans, while offering tax credits for verified renewable investments. So we bridge the gap between regulatory oversight and market innovation. So real democracy engagement requires informed public pressure, When citizens use open data to hold corporate actors accountable, we move from passive participation to active civic power. Bridging the gap between economic power and public good is the central challenge of modern civics. If we want a climate resilient future, it starts with holding both markets and governance accountable together.
Hi, I'm Rochelle, and after everything the team has laid out, I want to bring this back to something simple. The documentary, What is Democracy? Does not break down democracy with a single answer. Instead, it challenges viewers to think critically about who has power, whose voices are heard, and whether democracy can truly succeed without active citizen participation. One message stands out. Democracy is not something we simply inherit, it is something we practice every day. That idea connects directly to our civic participation campaign, Climate Action. Climate change affects everyone, yet opinions differ on the best way to address it because special interests oftentimes take precedent over what's right. The documentary reminds us that meaningful democracy requires citizens to listen to different perspectives, evaluate evidence, and participate in decisions that shape their communities. To better understand those different perspectives, think about everything you've just heard from Akash, Terri, Joe, and Daniella. The Brookings Institution's case for proactive government investment in clean energy, infrastructure, and innovation against the Heritage Foundation's case for protecting affordable energy and relying on market-driven solutions. Rather than viewing these perspectives as opposing sides with only one correct answer, it's worth recognizing that democracy depends on understanding competing viewpoints before forming conclusions. Effective civic participation requires citizens to examine evidence from multiple sources, ask thoughtful questions, and engage respectfully with others who may hold different opinions. Our team's analysis of what is democracy reinforced this idea again and again. Democracy is strongest when citizens move beyond simply reacting to issues and instead become informed participants in public decision making. Whether individuals support stronger environmental regulations or market based solutions, their voices matter when they participate. The Climate Action Campaign is ultimately about more than protecting the environment, it's about encouraging civic responsibility. Climate change affects public health, economic opportunity, and future generations, making it an issue that requires thoughtful public dialogue and active participation from communities across the country.
So, can democracy solve climate change?
We believe democracy gives us the tools, participation, accountability, cooperation, and open dialogue. Whether we succeed depends on how willing we are to actually use them and whether the people most affected are the ones we listen to first.
There's one more idea worth leaving you with. Robin Wall Kimmerer opens Braiding Sweetgrass with the story of Sky Woman Falling, an indigenous creation story where the first act on earth is reciprocity, giving back to the land that sustains you, instead extracting from it. That's opposite of growth at all costs model driving the crisis.
Thank you for listening to Civic Voices. Stay informed, stay involved, and remember democracy, like the land Kimmerer writes about, only stays healthy if we give back to it.